instead of serving as a tool to counter terrorism, Guantanamo became a symbol that helped al-Qaeda recruit terrorists to its cause. Indeed, the existence of Guantanamo likely created more terrorists around the world than it ever detained.
That was President Barack Obama speaking last May, explaining why he signed executive orders a year ago to close Guantanamo Bay prison, even though that hasn't happened yet. It also ended what the Bush administration called enhanced interrogation techniques, what others call torture. Obama's decisions continue to resonate today amid new terror threats and plots. And joining me now to discuss all of this, Philippe Sands, international lawyer and author of Torture Team, Rumsfeld's Memo and the Betrayal of American Values, and former top speechwriter for President George W. Bush, Mark Thiessen. He's author of Courting Disaster, How the CIA Kept America Safe and How Barack Obama is Inviting the Next Attack. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being on this program.
Thank you very much.
So you're here. How Barack Obama is inviting the next attack. That is very provocative. Do you think because he said that he's going to close Guantanamo Bay?
No, it's because he's eliminated the capability to capture, detain, and effectively interrogate terrorists. You know, if you think back to the period after September 11, 2001, we didn't know who had attacked us. We didn't know that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks or the operational chief of Al-Qaeda. And then we began to get capture terrorists, Abu Zubaydah, KSM, and we found out that there were two terrorist networks out there that were threatening us. The KSM network that hit us on 9/11 and the Hambali network, which KSM had tasked to fly an airplane into the Library Tower in Los Angeles and blow it up. So using enhanced interrogation, and I tell the story in my book, we rounded up those two terrorist networks. Now fast forward to 2009. There's a new terror network in Yemen called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The Obama administration admits we knew nothing about their plans to attack us in America, and we were caught blind on Christmas Day.
Well,
Why?
a couple of things here to throw to Philippe Sands. Number one, it is generally assumed right now and said, even by former Bush officials, that President Obama continues much of the anti-terror infrastructure that President Bush and the administration put in. Number two, about Yemen, that they did have the intelligence about this guy, but they didn't connect the dots. To you, Philippe, the fact that this Guantanamo Bay prison has not been closed, what signal is this sending?
Well, I don't think that's sending too much of a signal, because the intention is obviously to close it, and whether it was January this year or July this year or January next, the fact of its closure is a certainty, as President Obama puts it, and that has, I think, been very well received in many parts of the world as eliminating, as I think President Obama himself put it, one of the root causes of a recruiting tool. And of course this is a place, the United Kingdom, my country, has been. We're well aware of the situation in the 1970s where Britain did use many of the same techniques. And if you speak to British intelligence officers today and those who are active then, as well as former IRA people, they will tell you it was a terrific recruiting tool. But I really need to deal with the facts. I mean, Mark has written a terrifically entertaining book, but it's really a book of fiction because it's not evidence-based. I'm interested in facts. I read, for example, the sections where he wrote about the same person that I'd written about in my book, Mohammed al-Qahtani, alleged to be the 20th hijacker, and he describes the interrogation he was subjected to at Guantanamo in the autumn of 2002, and he says a great deal of information was found out from that man. Well, he obviously didn't speak to the head of al-Qahtani's exploitation team, who I did speak to, who basically said they didn't get anything really out of him at all that was meaningful and useful. And I think if you speak to seasoned interrogators, they will tell you maybe you get a little bit of information, you don't get a lot, but what you do get is completely overridden by the price that is paid of setting up a recruitment tool and recruiting others in their terrible cause.
Well, let me put that to Mark then, because that is what most counter-terrorist and intelligence officials say, that you actually don't get what you need. They'll tell you anything just to stop these harsh measures. And furthermore, today's news is that the United States believes that some 36 Americans who've been radicalized in prison here are now heading out to Yemen, and their whereabouts and actions unknown.
The people who say what Philippe says, that enhanced interrogation, you don't get anything because they'll tell you anything you want to know, don't know how enhanced interrogation is implied. Unlike Philippe and the other critics, I've actually spoken to the CIA interrogators, the people who waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and applied these enhanced interrogation techniques. And one of the things they told me, which was fascinating, when Abu Zubaydah, the first terrorist who was interrogated by the CIA, was waterboarded, he thanked his interrogators for waterboarding and said to them, "You must do this for all the brothers." And why did he do that? The reason he did it, he said, is because the jihadi philosophy is that Allah will prevail no matter what they do. So their moral responsibility is to resist as much as they can, and then once they have resisted, they are free to say whatever they want to do. They can spill their guts. Now, if you know that, how do you design an interrogation plan? You design an interrogation program that is safe, that will not harm the detainees, but gives them something to resist. And that is what the CIA did with these, and they got intelligence that stopped terrorist attacks.
Do you support torture? I know you do
It's not torture.
I know you don't call it torture.
It isn't
but
torture.
The extreme pain, the enhanced
There's no extreme
interrogation
pain. There is
techniques.
the technique. There have been so many misstatements told about the enhanced interrogation techniques, comparing them to the Spanish Inquisition, to the Khmer Rouge. And I have to tell you, Christiane, you're one of the people who have spread these mistruths.
Excuse me.
Well, I'm sorry. You went to S21, the Khmer Rouge prison and with Van Nath, who's one of the survivors.
Yes, and we saw the waterboarding there, which they used as torture techniques.
Let me read to you.
That's called spreading the truth.
No. Let me read to you what you said. I stared. This is from the CNN website.
Correct.
I stared blankly at another of Van Nath's painting. This time, a prisoner is submerged in a life-size box of water, handcuffed to the side so he cannot escape or raise his head to breathe. His interrogators arrayed around him, demanding information. I asked Van Nath whether he had heard this was once used on America's terror suspects. He nodded his head. It's not right. That is completely false. We did not submerge people in a box full of water. S21.
Excuse me a second.
S21.
That is called waterboarding.
No, it's
not. You can say in whichever way you want.
Christiane, you're absolutely wrong.
I'm sorry.
This was Pol Pot and the genocidal regime.
14,000 people killed at S21.
Correct.
7 survivors.
Excuse me. You're trying to obfuscate the debate here. That prison was full of images of water torture.
Which
you
is
can call
nothing
it
like what the CIA did.
It is what the Israelis use, the waterboarding. Philippe, how do you answer Mark on this?
I mean, in a very simple way. There is no doubt that waterboarding is torture. Mark supports waterboarding, and some will say, not me, some will say that by writing about it in this way, he is complicit in torture. I'm a passionate believer in... I'm a passionate believer in freedom of speech, and I don't believe people who write books are in that way, in any way, complicit. But those who engage in the activity of waterboarding are engaging in torture. Susan Crawford, President Bush's own convening authority at Guantanamo, has confirmed that Mohammed al-Qahtani, who wasn't even waterboarded, was tortured. But let me take it a step further. I mean, I understand that Mark doesn't think waterboarding is torture. Why doesn't he submit himself to that technique?
Because it's terribly unpleasant, and I'm not a terrorist.
I understand that he was intending to submit himself to that technique, but in the end bottled out of it because he didn't have confidence. He didn't have confidence that those who would impose it on him would necessarily pull the plug at the right moment. It is an appalling technique.
Okay, well, let me ask you this, because you've said your point, and Philippe said his point. I would like to know about what you recommend going forward. Now that the President has banned torture, enhanced interrogation techniques, what happens going forward, and what do you think,
Well, we should reconstitute the CIA interrogation program, but I want to answer this.
This same program?
I want to answer this because this is very important. First of all, what you had said was not waterboarding. You had said a bucket, a barrel filled with water. You have no evidence whatsoever that the CIA ever actually did what you said they did. But putting that aside,
you're splitting hairs, Mark.
No, I'm not. It's a barrel of water.
Oh, come on, Mark.
No. Hold on.
Dipping people's heads in water to simulate drowning.
No, listen.
Period. End of story.
Not period. End of story. I want to answer this, Christiane.
Mark, it matters not whether you put someone's head in a bucket of water.
It does. Let me tell you something. We waterboarded in the CIA. The CIA waterboarded 3 terrorists. Just 3. Nobody waterboarded in Guantanamo. You know who else the U.S. government has waterboarded? tens of thousands of American service members during their SEER training. We do not pull off their fingernails. We do not electrocute them with cattle prods. We do not pour hot oil down their nostrils or other forms of interrogation or do the things that were done to them in S-21, but we do waterboard them. Do you not think if waterboarding was torture, that one of those American service members would have complained to his congressman, there would have been congressional hearings, and it would have been banned by law? If we had been pulling off their fingernails, that would have happened.
Right. Well, we're talking about waterboarding, and certainly a lot of people have complained.
Can I put one question to Mark?
Yeah.
Christian, can I put one question to Mark? If it's not torture and if it's not a problem, do you have any objection to American nationals being waterboarded in other countries? Do you have any objection to American servicemen and women being subjected to waterboarding?
American servicemen and women are lawful combatants who are protected by the Geneva Conventions. Terrorists who are unlawful combatants who target innocent men and women and women are not lawful combatants, and you can interrogate them differently.
Can I ask you, Mark?
But the point is, why is water? I want to ask you, Philippe. Why is waterboarding American service members? Let me finish now. Why is waterboarding American service members not torture? Or do we torture our troops?
They're only done in training, as you know.
I think training is a completely different thing.
Okay, so you acknowledge that not all waterboarding is torture. So when we waterboard our troops, it's not torture.
Mark.
I find it incredible, Mark, that you would suggest that an American serviceman or woman who is put through that process, knowing that the moment he asks for it to stop, it will be stopped, could be the same thing as being waterboarded.
I want to ask the final question.
But Christian, can I just put this point? I take it that Mark has confirmed, as General Myers confirmed to me, as General Hill confirmed to me, it would be totally unacceptable in all circumstances for any American to be subject to any of these techniques abroad. Because they have Geneva Convention, full protections of the Geneva Convention, which terrorists do not merit.
Can I ask you this?
Yes.
Do you not think that all of this debate, including America's ability to keep dangerous people imprisoned, would have been enhanced had the Bush administration simply called them POWs from the beginning, put them away until the end of the war with the rights and protections of the Geneva Conventions, but kept them away in prison until the end of the war?
But why would we give them Geneva Convention protections? They don't merit Geneva Convention protections. They're terrorists. The Geneva Convention, this is one of the biggest myths about the Geneva Convention. It is not designed to govern the treatment of prisoners of war. It is designed to protect civilians from to get people to follow the laws of war. So if you give the same protections to someone who violates the laws of war as someone who follows them, you completely undermine the Geneva Conventions. But the point is, these techniques, as applied by the CIA, produced intelligence that stopped a terrorist attack to blow up our consulate in Karachi, to blow up our marine camp in Djibouti, for Al-Qaeda, they were planning to hijack an airplane and fly it into Heathrow Airport and buildings in downtown London. I hope nowhere near your offices, Philippe. And they were planning to fly an airplane into Library Tower in Los Angeles. So my question to Philippe is, which of these attacks would you prefer we hadn't stopped?
I simply don't accept your underlying premise that any information that has been obtained would have prevented these things. Let me test your proposition a different way. You argue that because these techniques were used in the United States, there were no further attacks on the mainland. How then do you explain the fact that in the United Kingdom, which doesn't use these techniques, there have been no further attacks in the last 5 years? The argument is a fallacious argument.
It's not.
It's a naive argument. It's straight out of, frankly, Mark, it's straight out of Monty Python.
Okay, listen, this is a very heated debate, obviously very, very strong convictions, and we are going to talk about it more on our website. We're going to continue this discussion, which you can all see on amanpour.com, and we'll be back right after a break in a moment, so stay with us. We welcome you back to a conversation that we're continuing online. It's about Guantanamo Bay. It's about enhanced interrogation techniques or torture, depending on how you think about it. And we're talking to Philippe Sands and to Mark Thiessen. Let's continue this discussion.
Sure.
I want to really talk about going forward.
Sure.
There are, as I say, any number of concerns put forth by people as high and elevated as General Stanley McChrystal in Afghanistan, to former CIA officials, soldiers, CIA personnel, etc., about what do we do about the real risks of keeping people in prisons where they can be radicalized. It's happening in Afghanistan, at Bagram and elsewhere, according to General McChrystal. It's happened in the United States, the latest reports being something like 36 Americans being radicalized and going to Yemen, and nobody knows what they're up to or potentially. So going forward, is moving this situation to an Illinois the right way to deal with it and to process them and to get it done?
Well, no, it's not. First of all, bringing these people to Illinois will mean that you cannot effectively interrogate them anymore.
Why do you say that?
I'll tell you, because one of the reasons the CIA program worked is because these terrorists were captured and they were taken to a place where they were completely isolated from the outside world, and so they could expose intelligence to them that, if it got out, would put American service members at risk. So, for example, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is being questioned, and they give him an intercept of a phone call where they have a voice and they don't know who the voice in the phone call is. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed identifies the voice. And all of a sudden, he now knows that we know who that operative is, what the phone line is, all sorts of intelligence. If he can then go the next afternoon and have a conversation with his lawyer, that information gets back to Al-Qaeda. So you cannot effectively interrogate these people. Absolutely, they do. It's been documented that lawyers have... people run mafia rings out of prisons. They run drug cartels out of prisons. Why can't they run a terrorist network? Groups. And why can't they run a terrorist network out of a prison?
Because doesn't it actually have to be... I mean... One unspoken part of this conversation is the rule of law. I mean, presumably you believe in the rule of law. America doesn't torture.
We don't torture, and we didn't torture. But here's the thing you have to understand why interrogation of these terrorists is so vital. I spoke in my book to many of the interrogators and also to former directors of Central Intelligence. And one of the things they told me is that intelligence is like putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle where you have all the pieces out on the table, but you don't know what the cover of the box looks like because you're not allowed to see the picture on the cover of the box. So you can you can get more pieces by all sorts of intelligence. But the only way you can get a picture of the cover of the box is by talking to the people who know what the box looks like. So when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or Abu Zubaydah or Ramzi bin al-Shibr, these high-value detainees, are interrogated, it's not that we're getting other pieces of information. They are helping us connect the dots. Okay. The only way you can connect the dots and put the pieces of the puzzle together is through interrogation of terrorists.
Let me ask you, Philippe, is it a good idea to deal with these people who've been in Guantanamo Bay in a proper court or rather a proper prison and system in Illinois, for instance?
Well, I think different people have to be treated in different ways. I mean, the situation in Afghanistan is one particular type of situation in which plainly there is an armed conflict going on, and whether the individuals are treated as prisoners of war or unlawful combatants, they are entitled to minimum rights, and it's our system of values that means that they are essentially incarcerated until the end of the conflict. So that's that category of individuals. There is another category of individuals. It is a real danger, it is a present danger, I think we all accept that, of people who want to commit terrorist atrocities on our lands and on our territories. What do we do about that? And I've argued long and hard, and I think the battle in Europe is one in that direction, that this is not war. This is for criminal law enforcement. And it's not war because by turning it into a war, you enhance the status of these individuals. You turn them from appalling criminals into warriors. And so I think what you have to do is you've got to separate out the individuals who are, if you like, engaged in an armed conflict, treat them in accordance with the laws of war and armed conflict, and those who are not directly involved, who are apprehended in Pakistan, in London, in Manhattan, or wherever, are entitled to be treated in accordance with due process and in accordance with criminal legal process.
Okay, I just want to clarify, because Mark said before the break when we were on television that the Geneva Conventions are not there to protect or grant any kind of provisions to the criminals or the terrorists.
No, that's just plain wrong. I mean, it's been one of the arguments that has been put forward by the Bush administration in 2002. One of the supporters of that idea is Douglas Feith, who was an assistant secretary in the Department of Defense. I notice, actually, interestingly, he's not mentioned at all in Mark's book, from which one could draw certain conclusions. But his idea was that you separate people out, non-terrorists and terrorists. Anyone who's a terrorist is, in effect, cast into a black hole and has no minimum rules governing them. That was rejected, not by me, it was rejected by the United States Supreme Court in the case of Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, which made it very clear that Article 3, Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, applies to everyone, alleged terrorists and others, and it sets minimum standards which prohibits waterboarding and other techniques of interrogation that Mark supports.
And Mark, wouldn't you agree, though, that there was actually in Guantanamo a sort of a dragnet of all sorts of people, some who had absolutely no value to the situation at hand, and some who were top-level terrorists and who would have done more harm?
The vast majority of people in Guantanamo were top-level terrorists, and many of them have actually left and gone out to back to the fight.
I don't think that's what the Guantanamo people say, not the vast majority.
I've been to Guantanamo. I've spoken to them. I've spoken to the head of intelligence in Guantanamo and to many of the interrogators, and there's clear evidence that they were. But one thing, on the Geneva Conventions, I'm a believer in the Geneva Conventions. My mother was a prisoner of war. She fought in the Warsaw Uprising in Poland during World War II, and she was a prisoner of war in Germany. So I'm a believer in the Geneva Conventions. I also know the limits of Geneva because the Nazis, one of my mother's cousins was murdered in Auschwitz by the Nazis.
Where there were no Geneva Conventions.
Well, there were the 1929 Geneva Conventions, and they were strengthened afterwards. But here's the point, that the purpose of Geneva is to prevent the kinds of atrocities that the Nazis committed by forcing people to follow the laws of war. And if you follow the laws of war, you get certain protections. And if you violate the laws of war, you do not earn certain protections. And so if you give terrorists POW, and there's a difference between what Philippe is saying, Common Article 3, and the prisoner of war thing, prisoner of war privileges you said. If you give them prisoner of war privileges, then you are taking away any distinction between the two, and there's no purpose. Then you encourage people to violate the laws of war.
But not really. I mean,
yes.
You can say that, but what it does is keep them incarcerated until the end of the war. You wouldn't have had to deal with all of this, because your point was to keep them incarcerated until the end of the war.
My point is to get intelligence. This is the problem, is that this is not about putting people who commit terrorist acts in prison. It is about stopping new terrorist attacks.
Okay, Philippe, on that point, how does one go forward? And this is the last word.
It's about how you interrogate them, not whether you incarcerate them. And Mark and I disagree on techniques. Mm-hmm. How you go forward, I think, is a very important question. I'm glad you've raised it. It's a challenge for the United States, it's a challenge for the United Kingdom, and it's going to be a continuing challenge. In some parts of the world, you go forward where there is genuinely an armed conflict. In Afghanistan, for example, the situation is particular. But we're not at war with Pakistan. We're not involved in armed conflict. What that means is we have to enhance our cooperation with the criminal justice services, with the intelligence services. We have to allow interrogation. Absolutely, I support interrogation, but lawful interrogation. And what it basically means is we are in this together. We have to coalesce around a common set of minimum values. The United States has long led the world in imposing a decent set of values, in imposing a rules-based system, a rule of law system. I'm delighted that the United States is back, leading from the front under the new administration. I accept that it's a tough challenge, but essentially that is the right way forward.
A sentiment you could agree with.
I would, except I want to ask Philippe, is there any circumstances under which you would agree to any form of coercive interrogation? Because we've talked about this, and I wonder if you'd say it publicly.
Sorry.
Is there any
I would engage?
If there's any circumstances under which you would support any kind of coercive interrogation, enhanced interrogation of any kind.
Well, I mean, look, we have talked about it. There's no. Well, no. We've talked about this. What I just said. Let me set out exactly what my position is. There are no circumstances, none, in which the use of, let us say, waterboarding or other forms of enhanced interrogation technique that you are a proponent of should be used. Every time it happens, it is illegal. Every time it happens, the person who does it exposes himself or herself to criminal investigation and to punishment. Mm-hmm. But, and there's been a recent German case that we know of, mm-hmm. in which a policeman sought to deal with a situation in which he held an individual who was believed to have kidnapped a child, and the police had an understandable desire to find the whereabouts of that child before he was killed. What then happened was the policeman threatened to torture the detainee. That, combined with other approaches, presumably led to the discovery of the whereabouts of the child, who unfortunately was dead. The policeman was then investigated and prosecuted and got a reduced sentence because of the circumstances. That is the way it was done, and that was the way it was done in accordance with a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. It is always illegal, but there are going to be circumstances where individuals take it upon themselves to do acts that are unlawful, and they do so taking full personal responsibility for that.
Gentlemen, Thank you very much indeed. And this is obviously a subject that is not going away, and we'll be discussing it over and again. Thank you very much.